Butler. I'm the executive director at Insight, and this is a workshop we've put together on emergency preparedness. I want to let folks know that this isn't a comprehensive presentation on emergency preparedness. It's really just designed to get you thinking about your own situation and how you can become better prepared for an emergency situation. So really I have three goals with today's presentation. Number one is I hope that you'll leave the presentation understanding why you should have some type of emergency plan. We're going to talk about the elements of an emergency plan, and we're also going to leave you with some things to consider as you're developing your own individual emergency plan. I want to start with my absolute favorite mantra in the world, which is credited to Benjamin Franklin, and it is failure to plan is planning to fail. And I have found in my life and in my career that most people avoid making a plan. A lot of us like to approach life by the seat of our pants and take things as it comes. But there are many advantages to making a plan. And when we have a plan in place, things go much better for us in the long run. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, you too will also believe that failure to plan is planning to fail. So I'm going to start with why we would plan for an emergency in the first place. Personal preparedness includes being ready for emergencies at home, at work, or anywhere that you spend a great deal of time. And it's important to remember that these preparedness efforts are a team effort. So it's very hard to plan for an emergency completely on your own. You really do have to involve other people in your planning for an emergency. It's important to plan for an emergency because being prepared can reduce fear, anxiety, and losses that may accompany emergencies and disasters. So I'm sure all of us can think back to a time when we were in an emergency situation or in a very stressful situation and what that felt like. Your mind typically is going about 1,000,000 miles an hour. You're trying to make 100 decisions in just a couple of seconds. Your heartbeat is racing. Your breathing might become difficult. It's very hard to think. It's very hard to focus. It's very hard to hear when people are talking to you. Everything kind of sounds like Charlie Brown's teacher, you know, wah, 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 because your brain is racing and your blood is racing and your heart is pumping. It's just very hard to concentrate. And so being prepared and having a plan helps us to reduce some of that fear and anxiety. What you do now can help you and your family respond to and recover from any disaster or emergency. And it also contributes to your community's overall readiness. So if you're prepared for an emergency and your family's prepared and your neighbors are prepared and everyone were to do that, then overall the community as a whole would be better able to respond to emergencies and disasters. I want to talk a little bit about the difference between an emergency and a disaster. So an emergency means that you must get out of whatever situation you're in fast. So emergencies could be a fire, it could be a buildup of carbon monoxide in the space where you are, it could be a gas leak, it could be an injury such as a broken leg or a heart attack. So with an emergency, the response needs to be immediate. Whatever you're going to do, you need to do very, very quickly and usually without any kind of warning. Emergencies are typically things that take us by surprise, that are very unexpected. A disaster, on the other hand, means that you stay home unless you are told to evacuate. A disaster could be a flood, a tornado, a hurricane, a power outage, an earthquake, a chemical leak. A disaster could mean that eventually you need to evacuate your home or your workplace, and possibly you may need to evacuate your neighborhood or the city and town where you live. But at least initially, in a disaster situation, you're sheltering in place. You're staying where you are. The first step in building an emergency disaster plan is to build a personal support network. This is especially important for people who have any kind of disability or special need. Building a personal support network is key to emergency preparedness for persons with disabilities. Also known as a self-help team, this group is responsible for checking on you during emergencies to ensure your wellness. Your support network can also help you identify resources related to the challenges a person with a disability faces when coping with hazards. Your self-help team can comprise neighbors, coworkers, personal care workers, relatives, family members, friends, and more. Experts recommend having at least 3 people to support you anywhere where you regularly spend time. You want to be able to show your personal support network where you keep your emergency supplies and ensure they have any necessary keys to be able to access where you live. They should also have copies of relevant emergency documents, evacuation plans, and health insurance cards. Finally, ensure your self-help team knows how to operate all of your medical equipment and devices. So it's also important to note that your personal support network may vary depending on where you are. So, for instance, for the visually impaired employees here at Insight, I may be, as the executive director of the agency, I might be part of their support network. Their direct supervisor may be part of their personal support network. The person in the office next to them may be part of their personal support network. I don't want and I don't need to have a floor plan of their house or have copies of their insurance cards or their emergency documents. But together, we do need to practice if there was a fire or a flood or another situation that required people to evacuate the building quickly. How, as a member of your personal support network, am I going to best help you to be able to evacuate the building? At home, again, that's when somebody would need your house keys or your apartment keys and your relevant emergency documents, because they're going to be in a much different situation with you. Besides having that personal support network, you also want to create an emergency kit. I'm going to go through the American Red Cross and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. Both have excellent resource lists, checklists of things that everyone should have in their emergency kit based on your individual situation. I'm going to go through a list of items that everybody should have in their emergency kit and pretty much show up on every checklist that I've looked at. But it's important to know that there are more extensive checklists with a lot more items on them. And that's one of the resources that I will send to people after the presentation today. The first thing you want is to have 1 gallon of water per person per day for at least 3 days for both drinking and sanitation. This is particularly important for people who live in a home that's serviced by a well. My understanding is that most wells are run by electricity. The pump that brings the water from the well into your home is powered by electricity. If you have no electricity, the pump can't work, which means that you are out of water until the electricity comes back on. But for safety reasons, depending on what the emergency or the disaster is, the town or the city may also have to shut off water to your neighborhood or specifically to your home for a period of time during the course of the disaster or the emergency. And so if you live alone, having 3 gallons of water in your pantry that you can drink until your water comes back on, or if the toilets aren't working or the sinks aren't working, that you could use for sanitation, is a good guideline to have. If there's 2 people in your home, you'd want 6 gallons of water. If there's 4 people in your home, 12 gallons of water. You want at least a 3-day supply of non-perishable food. This could be canned food, ready-to-eat food. Obviously, again, if you have no electricity for a period of time, your microwave is not going to work. Chances are your stove is not going to work. Even if you have a gas stove, most gas stoves now have an electric ignition to be able to spark the flame on the stove. So you may not have the ability to heat up food or cook food. So having at least 3 days of non-perishable food, could be tuna fish, could be cans of beans, could be cereal, anything that does not require to be cooked and that is shelf stable. You want to purchase things that are going to last for a while because they may be in your pantry for a while. We all remember during COVID what it was like with the supply chain issues, that none of us could get toilet paper and none of us could get canned food. And it seemed like every week there was another food item that was missing from the store shelves that we couldn't get for weeks and sometimes months. Because during an emergency and during a disaster, people tend to hoard things. So even if stores are still open during an emergency or a disaster, you may not be able to get perishable food because people are hoarding. So having that 3-day supply of non-perishable food in your pantry will help you get through the initial phase of that disaster or emergency. You want to have a battery powered or hand crank radio so that you can get news and information. Again, without electricity, you won't be able to get on the computer, your TV won't work. So you need something that's battery powered so that you can get up-to-date news and information. You want a flashlight as well as extra batteries. I would recommend having multiple flashlights available to you so that wherever you are and whatever you're doing, you have that accessible to you. I'm just going to remind folks to stay on mute during the course of the presentation. So if you are off mute, if you could put yourself back on mute, that would be great. You want to have a first aid kit, and you also want to know what's in the first aid kit. So I know I've been guilty of this myself. I've gone to Target. I bought a first aid kit off the shelf. I put it in the closet. Something happens. I need a Band-Aid or I need an ice pack. I open the first aid kit and the things that I'm looking for aren't in there. Or there's things in the first aid kit that I didn't know were in there. So it's important to have a first aid kit that you either buy ready-made off the shelf or that you put together yourself. But if you buy a ready-made first aid kit, you want to make sure you open it and that you have a good knowledge of what is in the first aid kit so that if you need something, you know that you have it in there. You also want to buy a whistle to signal for help. It doesn't have to be an expensive metal whistle. It can just be a toy plastic whistle that you get from a party store, or from Target, or from Walmart. The reason that you want to have a whistle is if for some reason you are trapped inside your home or you're trapped in your basement or in a closet because there was some kind of natural disaster, you can only yell. Your voice will only hold out with you yelling for about 10 minutes. So after about 10 minutes of yelling pretty consistently, you're going to lose your voice. So a whistle is a much easier, more effective way to signal for help because it just requires breathing into the whistle as opposed to straining your vocal cords trying to yell for help. You also want moist towelettes, garbage bags, and plastic ties for personal sanitation. So again, in the event that your toilet and sink are not working because of water supply issues and you're not able to leave your home to go to a shelter or to go to somebody else's house, having those items for personal sanitation will be very helpful. In the event of an earthquake, so we don't have a lot of severe earthquakes in Rhode Island, but FEMA does recommend having a wrench or pliers so that you could turn off your water and your natural gas utilities in your home. In the event of an earthquake, pipes could break, there could be leakage. And so the ability to know where those shutoffs are and how to shut off the water and gas in your home is important. You also want a can opener for food. So if that 3-day supply of non-perishable food contains cans or includes canned food, you want to make sure you have a hand crank can opener to be able to open those cans. So a lot of us have electric can openers. Again, in an emergency where there's no electricity, those electric can openers are not going to work. You also want to have a charger or an inverter or a solar charger for your cell phones. So hopefully with enough advance notice, you will have fully charged your cell phone before any kind of weather emergency. But your cell phone, depending on how often you're using it and what you're using it for, you may run out of battery power in your cell phone within a day or two. I know I have a small cell phone charger that I carry with me usually that I can plug my cell phone into. It holds enough charge to fully charge my cell phone twice. So those are fairly inexpensive. I got mine on Amazon. But you basically just plug your phone into the portable charger, and that charges up your cell phone. There are also some items that are very specific to people who have visual impairments that should also be in your emergency kit. You should have backup white canes at different locations. So you want a white cane at your home. If there are family members' homes that you spend a lot of time at, you may want to keep a white cane there. You may want to put a white cane in your disaster kit. You may want to keep an extra white cane. If you work, you may want to keep an extra white cane at work. Again, we'll get into this in a few minutes, but in an emergency or a disaster, there may be obstacles in your way, in your path of travel, that are not normally there. And it's going to be very hard, even with sighted guide, to be able to navigate some of those unexpected obstacles in your travel path. And so knowing how to use a white cane and having a couple of white canes in different places so they're available when you need them is going to be a big help. I mentioned flashlights. You want to store high-powered flashlights, meaning LED lights with wide beams and extra batteries in your emergency kit. Light sticks may also be helpful. So those light sticks that you kind of break and they provide some light in dark places may also be helpful. If you, whether you're in your home or apartment, or you have to go to a shelter, or you have to go to somebody else's home for a while during a disaster and emergency, chances are you're going to be given information that you're going to want to write down and be able to remember. So if you are somebody that writes and reads Braille, you want to make sure that you have a slate and stylus in your emergency kit. If you handwrite, you want to have 20/20 pens, a writing guide, large print or large bold line paper in your emergency kit as well, so that again you can take notes and write down information as that information is being given to you. You also want to have extra magnifiers, glasses, any kind of low vision devices that you use. If you can afford to have extras, it's important to have those extras in your emergency kit. And again, remembering that without electricity, your video magnifier, your Ruby, any of those kind of electronic devices are probably not going to work. So you need kind of old school magnifiers, battery operated magnifiers, and glasses. And if you have extras of those, having those in your emergency kit is going to be very helpful as well. You want to have a talking alarm clock or a talking watch or a Braille watch, something that will allow you to tell the time. Again, if you lose the charge in your cell phone and your cell phone is not working, you won't be able to rely on Siri or Google or Alexa to tell you what the time is. So having a talking alarm clock, a talking watch, or a Braille watch, even if you don't use it all the time, even if you just keep it for emergencies, will be a big help. And this, I think, is probably the most important one. You want to have your telephone and contact list in large print or Braille. So I am ashamed to admit that my oldest son has now had a cell phone since last October. He turned 12, and so we bought him a cell phone for his birthday. And if any of you offered me $1 million right now to tell you what his phone number is, I couldn't tell you because I have no idea. Because when I need to call Mason, I either use Siri or I go to my contacts on my phone and I hit Mason's name and it calls him. So I talk to him on his cell phone at least twice a day to check in, but I couldn't tell you what his telephone number is. In fact, I couldn't tell you what my mother's cell phone number is. There's a lot of people that I talk to every day that I couldn't tell you what their cell phone number is. I can remember my phone number from when I was 5 years old living in my parents' house, but I don't know most people's telephone numbers now because I don't dial in their phone numbers into my phone when I need to call them. But again, if you lose access to your phone, if your phone is damaged, it's lost, it runs out of battery, and it's not working, you may still need to reach out to friends and family members and coworkers And even if you can borrow somebody else's phone, if you don't know their phone number, it's not going to help you. And unfortunately, it's not like the old days when you could call directory assistance and say, I'm looking for Chris Butler at 43 Jefferson Boulevard, and they would give you my landline phone number. There really isn't a way to find people's cell phone numbers. So having those phone numbers in large print or braille and putting that list in your emergency kit or carrying it with you is going to be a big help in the event of an emergency. You also need to have a communications plan. So you want to sit down as a support network and create a communications plan. So you may have in your head, well, if there was ever an emergency or there was ever a disaster, these are the 2 or 3 people that I know I could call on who could help me. But it's important for those 2 or 3 people to also know that they are part of your support network, that if there is a disaster or there is an emergency, they know that you are counting on them as part of your emergency network. You want to make sure that everyone has each other's phone numbers and has phone numbers for other family or friends nearby who can help relay information. So if your primary support network is your son or your daughter or your grandchildren, but they live in Massachusetts, it would be helpful if they had the phone number for your next door neighbor. So that if they are in Massachusetts and you are in Rhode Island and there was an emergency or a disaster and they couldn't get to you quickly, they could call your neighbor and say, hey, I'm so-and-so's grandson, daughter, son. Would you mind just going next door and checking on them because I can't reach them, or they've called me to tell me that they have an emergency. Could you go and check on them and make sure that they are okay? If there is an evacuation, you want to choose a location where everyone is going to meet. So in my house, it's the telephone pole across the street. So if there was, an emergency where the 4 of us in my house needed to evacuate very quickly, it wouldn't be helpful if one person was going up the street, one person was going down the street, one person was going in the backyard, one person was going, across the street to the telephone pole. We've had conversations and we've practiced. If there is ever a need for the 4 of us to leave the house due to an emergency, we are all going to the telephone pole across the street. That's where we're going to meet. So it's important to choose that location, and everybody you live with and everybody in your personal support network needs to know that that's where the location is that everyone is going to meet. You also want to arrange for more than one person for your personal support network to check on you in an emergency, so there is at least one backup if the primary person you rely on cannot contact you or is unable to contact you. So make sure that you always have a plan A and a plan B. In the event of an emergency or a disaster, my son is the one that's charged with calling me and checking on me and making sure that I'm okay. But if your son is also caught up in the same emergency or the same disaster, they may not be able to reach you or to come to you. And so having that second person designated who is also going to call you or come to you is important. The next thing you want to have as part of your emergency preparedness plan is an evacuation plan. You want to make a floor plan of your home, and this could be a tactile map. Several years ago, we did a workshop where Melissa, who was our mobility instructor, actually had people make a tactile map of the first floor of their home or apartment. So you want to make a floor plan of your home, including your primary escape routes. And you may want your network, your support network, to assist you with this project. On the floor plan, you want to mark the rooms you spend the most time in. You also want to mark where your disaster supplies kit is located. And you want to give your network a copy of the floor plan to help them find you and your supplies if necessary. So if you know you spend most of your time in your bedroom and your living room, that's helpful for people to know. Not only if your support network is coming into your home to try to find you, but if they are on the phone with first responders and saying, okay, well, my mom, has had an emergency. She spends most of her time in the living room. When you go in the front door, this is how you get to the living room. And so your primary support person can kind of look at the floor plan and be able to explain to a first responder how to find you and where to find you. And that will cut down on the amount of time it takes you to get assistance. If you must leave your home or workplace, you may need someone's help to evacuate safely, especially down stairwells. If you need assistance during an emergency and your network is unavailable, find helpers and tell them about your condition. Give them instructions on what you need and how they can help you evacuate. So if you are in an apartment building or an office building, and the people who you thought were going to be around to help you evacuate the building are not around at that particular time, you want to find anybody else that can help you. And it may be a first responder that's in the hallway. It may be a neighbor. It may be a coworker. It's somebody who is sighted who can help you to get out of the building. But it is going to be important for you to tell them, look, I am visually impaired. I have no central vision. I have no peripheral vision, whatever your visual situation is. I need you to do sighted guide. I am going to grab onto the back of your elbow and I want you to walk 1 or 2 steps in front of me. And I need you to tell me when we get to doorways and when we get to stairs. So you need to be very explicit about what your personal situation is and very explicit about the type of help that you need. Remember, this is an emergency situation or a disaster situation where everyone's adrenaline is pumping, where people's heart rate is increased, where people are having a really hard time trying to focus. And so being clear and explicit about what you need is not only going to help you, it's going to help the person that's trying to assist you. And you want to practice using different ways out of a building, especially if you are above the first floor in a building with many stories. Remember, the elevator may not work or should not be used. So for instance, here at Insight, there are 2 exits from the building. I think most people are familiar with the back parking lot entrance that when you come into the building, the boardroom's on the right and the double doors are in front of you. But there is actually another exit in the back of the building that goes out to Jefferson Boulevard, that goes out to the parking lot in Jefferson Boulevard. So it's important, especially for the staff here, especially those who are visually impaired and blind, to know that there are 2 exits, where those 2 exits are, how many stairs there are from that back exit up to the Jefferson Boulevard exit. And once they get out into that Jefferson Boulevard parking lot, where they should go to be safely away from the building. And that's something that folks should be practicing so that, again, in an emergency, in a disaster, when it's really hard to focus, because you've practiced it, your brain just kind of takes over and says, okay, I know what to do in this situation. And it carries you through the steps. You also want to make sure that all of your escape routes are clear of objects for safe evacuation. I know that there are some people that store stuff on their stairwells, or they decorate for Christmas and they put decorations on their stairwells. You may stack things up next to you very rarely use your front door or your back door. So maybe you stack stuff around the door or in front of the door. It is really critical that you never have anything on your stairs, in front of evacuation doors, and your escape route. So if your bedroom's on the 2nd floor of your house and you need to go down the stairs and across the living room to get out the front door, that entire path should be completely free of any objects or obstacles that could trip you up. On an average day like today, you can get down the stairs and through the living room and out the front door with no problem, even with those objects in your way. In an emergency or in a disaster, when it's hard to focus, those things are going to become tripping hazards because your focus is going to be on getting away from whatever the dangerous situation is as quickly as possible. And your brain's not going to remember where those things are. It's just going to try to get your body out as quickly as possible. So make sure that those routes are clear. You also want to keep in mind that there could be debris in your home or along your planned exit route following a disaster. So especially a natural disaster, a hurricane, a tornado, an earthquake, a flood. You could have branches, trees, garbage, debris, your neighbor's lawn furniture out in your front yard. Stuff that's not normally there is all of a sudden there. If there is a fire in your home or a flood in your home, some kind of disaster in your home, furniture could be moved into different places where it isn't normally there, or objects could fall off the wall into your escape path. So you have to have a plan for how you are going to overcome those unexpected obstacles that could be in your way. To me, I think one of the key tools to consider is a white cane. Again, having a long white cane, having training in how to use that long white cane, the long white cane is going to detect obstacles in your way before you trip over them or before you fall over them. So I think for everyone, having a white cane, even if it's just used in emergencies, is a very powerful tool. You want to plan for accessible transportation for an evacuation or getting around during or after a disaster. Check with local transit providers and your emergency management agency to identify appropriate accessible options. So it's important to remember that during an emergency or during a disaster, you're not going to be able to access the ride program. You may or may not be able to access rideshare services like Lyft and Uber. So you want to check with every city and town has somebody who's designated as the emergency management director or emergency management coordinator. You can certainly find out who that person is in your city or town. Call that person and say, hey, I went to a workshop recently about emergency preparedness. I have a visual impairment. I'm concerned that if there was ever an emergency or a disaster, that I can't drive away from my home, but I would need to get somewhere safe. How would I do that? What is our city and town's plan? Would I call the police? Would I call the fire department? Would I call EMS? Would I call emergency management? What would be the process that I would use in order to access transportation to get me to a safe place? And it's also important to remember that if you have a dog guide, service animals are allowed in hotels, motels, and Red Cross emergency shelters. However, these places cannot care for your animal. So when you leave your home, you have to take with you the dog's collar, harness, identification tags, vaccination records, medications, and food. So once you are in an emergency shelter or in a hotel or a motel, even during an emergency or a disaster, it's your responsibility to take care of that animal. And so you need to make sure that in your emergency kit, that you have all of those supplies and copies of all those records so that if you need to evacuate quickly, you can take care of your animal, at least for a short period of time, until you get settled and can access other help. And most importantly, you need to be able to advocate for yourself. You need to practice quickly explaining the best way to guide or move you and your adaptive equipment safely and rapidly. You have to be ready to give brief, clear, and specific instructions and directions to rescue personnel, either orally or in writing. When I go to marketing workshops about how you market your nonprofit agency, the marketing professionals always talk about having an elevator speech. That if you were stuck in the elevator, if you were riding from the first floor to the third floor of an elevator with somebody, and the person in the elevator said to you, "Oh, so what do you do?" Or they saw Insight written on my shirt and they said, "Oh, what's Insight?" I should be prepared with a 1 to 2 minute elevator speech. In 1 to 2 minutes, I should be able to explain to somebody what Insight is and what Insight does and why it's important. So you need to have an elevator speech for you, for how somebody can best guide you or move you and any equipment that you might have. Again, in an emergency, in a disaster, there's not a lot of time. People aren't thinking clearly. It's hard for them to focus. So you need to be very brief, clear, and your instructions need to be very specific. And in order to do that, you need to practice this. And it might seem silly to sit in your living room and practice your elevator speech, 10 or 15 or 20 times. And you may never need it. Hopefully you never need it. But because you've practiced it and because you know it down cold, in those emergency situations, your brain will be able to access it and spit it out without a problem. You also always want to have a plan B. So emergencies and disasters can unfold in unpredictable ways, and even carefully made plans may need to adapt to changing circumstances. That's why always having a backup solution for the most critical parts of your emergency plan is so important. So you want to think about every aspect of your emergency plan, the, the, the helpers that you have around you, the things that are in your emergency kit, your evacuation plans, all of those things. You want to make sure that you have a plan B, that if what I thought was going to happen doesn't happen, I have something else that I can fall back on. So always have a plan A and a plan B for any type of plan that you make. During an emergency or a disaster, it's also going to be very important to stay informed in real time about what is happening. You want to focus on reliable sources. So locally, the TV news stations would be a great place to turn to access information. Channel 10, Channel 12, Channel 6. In the event that you don't have electricity and your television's not working, you may turn to the radio. Again, you should have a battery-operated radio tuned to 630 WPRO. That is the local news station. They will be broadcasting the latest emergency alerts and providing you with the latest information. If you have a smartphone or a tablet, you can also download news apps onto your device. So the Providence Journal app, the Boston Globe app, the Channel 10 and Channel 12 news apps. So those apps will provide you, again, with the most current, up-to-date, truthful information about what is happening with this emergency or disaster. You can also turn to social media, but I have in all caps, in parentheses, reliable sources. So you have to remember, you may find this hard to believe, but not everything you read on the internet is true. And some people take advantage of people's high emotions and fear and anxiety during a disaster or during an emergency to push their own agenda. And very often that type of behavior presents itself on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, on YouTube, any of those social media types of channels. So you may be reading something that somebody who's very well-meaning, but is just not completely informed about the situation. They may put information out there that's not completely accurate. Again, people may put information out there to serve their own agenda as opposed to trying to help you. So if you're going to use social media as a news source, you want to only look at accounts that you would consider reliable sources. The Emergency Management Agency, social media, the Rhode Island Public Transit Authority, social media, the news stations, the newspapers, the Associated Press, the governor's office. So you want to follow and pay attention to what government officials are saying, what emergency responders and first responders are saying, and what the news stations and the news media is reporting, as opposed to neighborhood Facebook groups or crazy conspiracy theorists. During normal times, those posts can be somewhat entertaining, and you take them with a grain of salt. But again, in an emergency, in a disaster, you're really desperate for information. And so it can be very easy to fall into looking at unreliable information on social media. The last thing I wanted to mention, and I think that everyone should consider, is enrolling in the Rhode Island Special Needs Emergency Registry, which lets police, fire, and other first responders in your community better prepare for and respond to your needs during a hurricane, storm, or other emergency. The Rhode Island Department of Health and Rhode Island Emergency Management Agency have worked with E911 to notify first responders when responding to a household that may have someone enrolled in the registry. While registering in the Rhode Island Special Needs Emergency Registry does not guarantee assistance, This notification allows first responders additional time to consider how to best respond to that incident. And there is a link on this slide. I am going to send the link to everyone that's on the workshop today. So that'll be one of the resources that I send you along with the recording of today's workshop. The registry is voluntary, so you certainly don't have to sign up for it, although I strongly encourage it. There is a very simple form that you can fill out online. And in the event of a disaster or an emergency, again, first responders would be given information before they arrived to you that you are somebody with a visual impairment, and so you may need extra assistance or special assistance. If you are on oxygen, if you are on dialysis, if you have any special equipment or special medical needs, they will also know that. Being on the registry also helps those emergency management people who work in your city or town to know where the priority areas are. So if you are somebody who is on dialysis 2 or 3 times a week, they will, if you are registered as part of the special needs emergency registry, they will know that. And so if they know that there's a power outage in town and that you need to get to dialysis 2 to 3 times a week, you will be flagged as somebody they need to reach out to very early in the emergency or disaster response to figure out the transportation options to get you to dialysis or to get you a portable dialysis machine that they could bring to your home. Again, if you are somebody who's visually impaired, blind, hearing impaired, the first responders will know in advance of coming to you that you may need some special assistance. So there's a lot of upside to being on the registry. It is obviously all of the information in the registry is HIPAA protected, so it's not shared with anyone outside of the Department of Health and the emergency management agency folks who work in your city and town. And in the event of an emergency disaster, the information would be shared with first responders. With that, I am going to stop the recording and stop sharing my screen.